Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to this Basel Institute on Governance research webinar. We'll be serving up food for thought on two quite fundamental ideas about that affect how we think about corruption and how we tackle it. So first, the idea that we need to move from thinking about corruption as isolated acts by individual rotten apples, rotten eggs, but as complex adaptive networks and systems. And second, linked to that corruption doesn't disappear in response to anti-corruption measures, but evolves to get around them. So this is an example of where research and deep thinking have real practical implications for tackling corruption, organized crime, sanctions evasion, all the bad things that come with that. So we're lucky to have three people at the forefront of thinking about how corruption really works and how that affects how we prevent and combat it. So I'll let them introduce themselves briefly, if they will come on stage. Claudia, let's start with you.
Of course. Hi, everybody. My name is Claudia Baez Camargo. I am Director of Prevention, Research and Innovation at the Basel Institute on Governance. Thank you.
Super, thanks. And Jacopo?
Yes, thank you, Monica, and welcome everyone. So my name is Jacopo Costa. I'm senior specialist in Claudia's team, working for the Prevention, Research and Innovation team. I'm also principal investigator for the Basel Institute for an Horizon Europe project that is called Falcon. Is a 3 years Horizon project, which is aiming to innovate the fight against corruption by introducing and applying new technologies such as artificial intelligence and others. And like this presentation, this event is under the umbrella of the Falcon project. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and thanks, Monica.
Thanks so much, Jacopo. And Maria, over to you.
Thanks, Monica. Hello, everybody. I'm Maria Nizzero. I'm the Principal Head of Sanctions Policy at UK Finance, and I'm also an Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, which is a security and defence think tank in London. Thank you for inviting me.
Super, thanks so much. So here's how to work. We'll start with Jacopo. He'll do a deep dive into Italy as a case study. And that really shows the network nature of grand corruption and how it's evolved over time. So that sets the theoretical framework. Maria's research and recent really fascinating paper looks at how understanding corruption with this network lens might open up new ways to tackle it, using the UK as an example, but I think it has global implications actually. Then we'll switch to Netherlands and Bulgaria, back to Jacopo and with Claudia too. Our team did some really interesting field research under the Falcon project that Jacopo just mentioned, which studies how organized crime and corruption interact and affect one another. And then we're going to step back and look at together at how we can better anticipate changes in how corrupt people and their helpers, I'm not going to say enablers, get around the controls. And secondly, make sure that anti-corruption measures or tools are actually going to be effective in the long term, or at least not have unintended consequences and make the situation worse by making these corrupt networks more resilient and more sophisticated. So we're focusing on corruption, but this is often actually really highly relevant to broader organized crime, sanctions evasion, illicit political finance, foreign interference, all of these things. The Q&A should be active, so we very much welcome your thoughts and questions. Feel free to put them in the Q&A anytime. We might be able to pick them up during the presentations, and otherwise we do our best to answer as many as we can at the end. So, Jacopo, take us away with your story from Italy. Thank you.
Now, okay. So I would like just to start giving you a few indications. As Monica explained you just right now, I will start just giving you an idea of this conceptualization of the evolution of corruption and the specific application of this model, this approach to the case of Italy. I will, build this part of my presentation on a paper that we have together with Claudia, we are just very recently published in February 2026. And this is, a paper combining a conceptualization of the topic with the application to a specific case study. So, starting with explaining the goal of this paper. So we started from an idea that, we know those who work in the field of corruption, anti-corruption, and so far and so on. We know that, very much like other human behaviors, corruption, but also criminal strategy tend to evolve over time. No, the point is the why and how corruption and criminal modus operandi evolve over time is still unclear. We perceive there is something there, but we have not so much empirical findings or empirical confirmation to this model of evolution and adaptation of corruption or criminal strategies. So our idea, that was more or less the main point made in our paper, is that this evolution and adaptation of corrupt or criminal strategy is basically driven by the changes in the behaviors of the individuals who sit into the criminal network. So it's not something that really comes from the top, but this mechanism of evolution and transformation start from below and from to consolidate then into different models and characterization of corrupt exchange. So we have tried to identify a sort of nonlinear and complex, cause-effect chain, and starting from the changes that happen in the contextual conditions, and we will give a look a little bit to what are the factors and the determinants of these changes in contextual conditions. This is leading to changes in node behaviors. That is, of course, a sort of transformation, evolution of the strategies, modus operandi, that then, once they reveal to be successful in the finalization of the corrupt exchange, they tend to spread across networks because of the role of people sitting in two or more criminal or corrupt networks, because of collaboration, cooperation between different individuals, the role of brokers, so far and so on. What we obtain at the end is a change in the illicit behaviors characterizing corruption or criminal strategies. Of course, our theoretical framework is built on a few specific pillars. The first one, and here we can reconnect to the point that Monica was making, very clearly, is about we are convinced that corruption is a very networked phenomena. So basically, it's polyadic rather than dyadic, and the dyadic nature of corruption is the one, for example, modelized in the principal agent model. Of course, here we are speaking about something different. So we are unpacking ecosystems that are basically complex and that have also evolutive dynamics. So they tend to go through a cycle of accumulation and destructions. As I told you before, these corrupt networks tend to be dynamic ecosystems. So we see this because, they have scale-free structures. They tend to follow these sort of adaptive cycles that characterize complex ecosystems. We can identify a contribution from the catastrophe theory once there is a collapse in a corrupt network because of investigation or the arrest of the most important nodes into a network. And then finally, the innovation in the illicit strategies are driven by the nodes who sit in the network, as I told you before, that adapt their behaviors and strategies in response to new contextual conditions. So what is creating, a new contextual condition? We have identified different dimensions that can be relevant for pushing, for fostering this, transformation of context. Technology is one of them. For example, of course, is not the same to, for example, think about the introduction of computer or the introduction of cryptocurrencies and how this new technology can impact, for example, the way or the strategies that we adopt to finalize a corrupt exchange. But at the same time, the legal, regulatory, governance framework, of course, are very relevant for determining or shaping these contextual conditions. A situation where we have improved control or new surveillance powers, or changes in social, economic, and political conditions. So once we have elaborated this conceptual framework in the first part of the paper that Claudia and I have written together, we try to apply the model to a specific case study, and of course was quite easy. I'm Italian, so for me it was quite easy to of course trying to focus our empirical attention on Italy for different reasons. We know that Italy is considered one of those countries in Europe that is struggling, of course, with the problem of corruption. We know that over time, we had very different scandals of corruption, and some of them, like Tangentopoli or the Clean Hands investigation in the early 90s was, really famous and discussed and debated in academia, but also, newspaper and so far and so on. But at the same time, we can identify, and this was a strength of our paper, 3 different moments over time. The first one is, in fact, early 90s with Tangentopoli, and what we have seen is a sort of pyramidal model of corruption. I will describe shortly later. Then there is a second moment when we see and we try to analyze the transformation in the contextual conditions between mid-90s and the late 2000s. And finally, we start to move to the characteristic of corruption in the early 2010s, when we have seen a more balkanized model of corruption, so with very different characteristics. So the point is, this study goes through, 2 moments where we have the configuration of corruption that are different among themselves, the early 90s and the 2010s. And then in the middle, we have the evolution and the transformation of the contextual conditions. So, just to give you an idea, of course, Tangentopoli or Clean Hands, as I told you, is a quite famous case of corruption in Europe, in Italy, and in Europe too. Of course, what we had here, was basically a corrupt system, a corrupt model that was organized by political parties. There was the distribution of illicit proceeds between political parties and the influential groups and factions that were sitting into these political parties. At the top of the system, we had sort of party committees made by political and administrative secretaries of the political parties that were those taking the critical decision, they were representing the critical decisional center for corrupt exchange, coordinating the exchange, co-opting or giving indication on the actors to co-opt into the criminal networks, operating strategies for camouflaging, and so far and so on. What we have seen, also another characteristic was that each level of government, starting from the very local one, the regional one, and the national one, was characterized, by their own networks and political committees. But the very important characteristic was this sort of vertical integration into a pyramidal structure that was governed, from the top by the party leaders of the most important Italian political parties in the 80s and very early 90s. So, like all these illicit funds that were collected at the local and regional level were somehow siphoned up towards the national level. And as I told you before, in these party committees, there were like control, coordination, cooptation, camouflage, conflict resolution, all sitting into these structures. So what changes between the 90s and early 2000s was basically, we had much more attention from journalists, civil society organizations, and criminal justice actors on the problem of corruption in Italy. So, of course, the criminal justice change, was really intensifying his activities against corruption. We had also the transfer, of anti-mafia modalities to the anti-corruption domain, like wiretappings, shadowing activities, financial, investigation on the financial activities and so forth. And so on. So what was the result? A blatant model of corruption was much more difficult to be implemented. So this, of course, forced the corruptors, a next generation of corruptors, we can say something like this, to improve camouflage strategies. Second point, very important, was relevant changes in the structures of political party. There was a reduction in their capacity to mediate between social groups and business players. There was new space. There was space for new collective actors to become central in corrupt exchange, and we will see later which one are. And then there was an important wave of reforming the management of public affairs and this distribution of powers between politicians and bureaucrats. So there were new appointment procedures for public offices. The political spheres, received basically political direction, while the public managers received managerial directions. There was a sort of the creation of a safe belt of supervisory bodies to waterproof the public administration from the risk of corruption, and then a new legal framework for managing strategic infrastructures and public works, like the big events category. And we will see, and we have seen empirically how all these changes in different domains, so more attention from journalists, civil society, criminal justice, the reform, the transformation of the political parties, and then new regulation, new laws. We have seen how this impacted really the corrupt strategies in Italy in the early 2010s. What we have seen and what was the novelty was really the absence of a centralized actor in the corruption domain. There was the lack of an infrastructure mirroring the capacity to control the corrupt exchange that these party committees had. So what we have seen is really the creation of a balkanized system of corrupt networks, of course connected each other, but missing a central point of coordination, cooptation, camouflage, and so far and so on. So every single network, and you can see this in the figure, that I've entered in my presentation, every single network was autonomous in pursuing its own objectives and strategies. And, at the core space of each network, we found what we could define like corrupt associations. In Italy, in this case, was cricca, committee, or many different labels. It was basically based on a combination of politicians, bureaucrats, entrepreneurs, professionals, and criminals. So there was really, the transformation of the structure sitting at the core of the corrupt exchange, but at the same time there was a relevant change in the connections, in the relations between the actors sitting at the core, sitting into these corrupt associations, and those sitting at the periphery of the network. For example, there was the use of informal exchanges, much more relevant than before. So we had, favors involving family members and friends. Bribes started to include expensive gifts and luxury goods, apartment, vehicles, luxury jewelries, watches. We had holidays, payment of holidays to exotic location, wedding banquets. There was the support of, a career advancement in the public spheres, the appointment of professionals as members of arbitrational panels, for example. So what we have seen on one side was, the transformation from what we mean really corrupt exchange in terms of bribes, to, you know, like something that was a little bit more in the direction of favor exchange or satisfying requests coming from individuals sitting in the public administration and so far and so on. At the end of the day, what we have seen was a process to capture in criminal network all those public actors, all those public bodies, you know, which have received in time, in the previous decade, you know, powers and tasks to manage public works and monitor their integrity, transparency, and correctness. So there was this informal or gelatinous effort, you know, like to connect, capture, and neutralize the duties, the tasks, the functions of these actors and public bodies. So, Monica, I will stop here the first part of my presentation and leaving.
Thank you so much, Jacopo. If anyone was thinking that corruption was all about just individual bad people doing individual bad things, I think that Jacopo's presentation has banished that. Maria, that's quite fundamental to your research as well. In fact, I've got your paper here. You talk about a deep conceptual failure, I wrote it out, to understand how modern kleptocracy actually operates. And you introduced the concept of a kleptocratic enterprise. So that really takes it a step further. So tell us first, I mean, why you think it's useful to think about corruption as a network, and then how you think that will open new practical possibilities to tackle it. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Monica. I think that, so first of all, starting from the beginning, the way that we conceptualize and the way that we let, you know, that essentially our research led us to reframe kleptocracy as an enterprise. It started mostly by looking at why we couldn't go after the kleptocratic assets, especially here in the UK. Obviously, you know, post-Russia full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the role of London and just general, you know, international financial centers in facilitating these illicit flows, you know, leaving the countries and just corrupting even our democracy. That was the moment that we kind of shone a spotlight on the London-grad sort of role, but not only. What happened, however, while shining a spotlight on the role of London, etc., in facilitating illicit financial flows, we also saw the limitations in the current system with regards to going after the kleptocrats, going after their assets. So in a different way, rather than starting from what is kleptocracy and how should we frame it is, okay, so we have this massive issue. We want to go after the kleptocrats. We want to go after the assets. How do we do it? Why is it not possible? So essentially, we kind of did what Jacopo and Claudia did, looking at the phenomenon of corruption, but starting from how to tackle it and going backwards, leading us then to a definition of the kleptocratic enterprise. So starting from the assets, there are some specific things that, you know, if you have read asset recovery papers, even the ones that have been published by the Basel Institute of Governance, which I'm a huge fan of. So thank you to Andrew Donbiro for the basic research that has led me to that. There are some commonalities. It's very difficult to trace the assets. They are hidden in complex, you know, ownership structures. It's very difficult to target the individual. You know, they might not be in the specific country. They might be absconding. They might, because it's so difficult to track and trace essentially the beneficial ownership, you will not potentially get to that specific individual. In some cases, when we think about corrupt actors, especially international corruption, there is this element that I like to call the historic criminality element. That's what I describe it usually as the original sin, in the sense that the assets have been so mixed with illicit and licit activities that actually getting back to that original crime, that original sin, is basically impossible, especially if you know, the original corruption happened in 1990s and move forward on that. The other point is, you know, when we talk about international corruption, if there is evidence, in some cases it might not be typified as corruption. It might have been completely legal because it is a kleptocracy, it's a state of state capture, or just simply the jurisdiction is not cooperative, or, you know, imagine a case like Russia and is completely hostile. So how would you get that sort of international cooperation. And then finally, there is the big element, which is the element that Jacopo has kind of mentioned, you mentioned at the beginning in your introduction, which is the matter of enablers, professional service providers, essentially. So you have your lawyers, your accountants, your trust and company service providers, our market participants, which are my favorite, or even just PR firms. They all help in concealing, hiding, protecting, legalizing even the wealth of these individuals in such a way that regardless of how good your legal system really is, you can't get there. And that leads me to the final problem, which is even if you were, a country like, I always say the UK has a very strong legal framework in actually to go after the assets. But even if you were going after those assets, there is that political element there that makes it even more complicated because the assets belong to individuals that are entrenched essentially with the political structure of another country. So diplomatic issues may even arise. So we looked at all these challenges and then we were like, okay, so how do we try to obviate, not completely, it would be absurd to assume that we are going to, completely solve all those challenges, but is there a way that we can mitigate it? And the matter of enablers, that led us to the bigger picture in a way, because as Jacopo was highlighting, these corrupt individuals, they stopped operating singularly individually, but they have started actually operating in a much broader networks. In many cases, I now represent lots of banks, and in many cases, it's quite interesting to see how some of the professional enablers, they will provide the same exact services to potentially the same kind of kleptocrats or even to organized criminal organizations and so forth. So there is a sort of a cooperation, we're struggling with international corporations ourselves, but the criminals, on the other hand, they are quite good at engaging with each other. And so you see these clusters and these networks appearing. And, there have been a couple of operations recently in the UK that have actually shown how it's not just the organized crime, it's not just the drug cartel, it's the Russian kleptocrat that relies on the same lawyer to structure, and hide their wealth. But then the same lawyer might provide, services to a drug dealer and then buy property in Canada or whatever it is. So it's multi-jurisdictional and it is also quite network. So looking at that, we realized that essentially there is a client, whatever it is, whether it is an organized crime, whether it is, as I said, a corrupt actor, that demands for their money to be hidden, protected, legalized, and so forth. And then it is indulged through services, for instance, real estate, as I said, PR, firms, complex ownership, structuring, and so forth, by a network of enablers, of services, essentially. These networks, Jacopo has highlighted, they are slowly changing, but they're very similar to the ones that, as I said, are the ones of organized crime. So they sometimes leverage the issue of technology. We're seeing how their practices and their techniques are changing, also facilitated by that. Crypto is one. They might rely on sanction evasion, for instance, or actually facilitate sanction evasion. They rely often on the same jurisdictions. There are some countries that are known, I would say, to be sort of hubs, not just to receiving money, but also to facilitate these sort of services. And then obviously, as I said, there are some techniques that are quite similar. So what we did was, well, actually, if there is a client and there is a services and there is a network, that's exactly the same way that a business operates, whether it is organized crime or corruption. There is just one term, and that term is enterprise. And we used, as a result, the concept of enterprise. It's actually borrowed from the Racketeering Act in the UK, in the US. It's quite of an interesting one. And we look at the sort of, as I said, it's not just the country. We disconnect the political element. So it's not corruption as part of a country and the corrupt networks that just stays in one country, but it's corrupt individuals operating together, regardless of where they're from, as a network and rely on the same professional enablers, hence the enterprise. And that kind of unlocks a series of other things, because if we then approach corruption in the same way that we approach organized crime, then, like Jacopo, I'm Italian, we do have a long history of going after the mafia. So I started thinking, is there anything in the way that we approach organized crime, not just Italy, but other countries? We looked at the US, we looked at Switzerland, we looked at Ireland, South Africa as well. So is there anything in those racketeering laws that can be useful to then go after the corrupt actors and their assets, and as a result, obviate the challenges that I said at the beginning. And the reality, yes, there are some things, you have lots of, for instance, one of the main things is they focus on the pattern of conduct rather than on the individual people. They focus on the broader networks in many cases. So as a result, you could go after, if you wanted to, you could go after the lawyers, the accountants, the people that I said that are members of the kleptocratic enterprise or the criminal organization, if you want to see it like that. Most of the racketeering laws, they combine different legal tools, which I think is always better than just focusing exclusively on the criminal path, on the civil path, the administrative path. Why not have lots of different kinds of tools? Even sanctions, it's not well used, but the anti-mafia code, for instance, it includes sanctions as a starting point for a route towards asset confiscation. So why shouldn't we try to do the same, but towards corruption? And then finally, I think, well, actually, Jacopo has mentioned it, they also allow some practices, which so far, at least in the UK, they haven't necessarily been very used or welcomed because they lowered kind of the threshold for the evidentiary burden, really. There can be wiretapping. In Ireland, there is this thing called belief evidence, which is obviously based on the belief of a police officer that there is organized criminal conduct. So they stretch the limits still within what we all love and cherish, which is the limits of the due process and rule of law, but they stretch the evidentiary burden so that it can comprehend some of those practices. And then finally, I think that the big thing that some, if not all of the racketeering laws that I've seen do, they have an approach to organized crime, which is quite interesting, which is the focusing on the impact that they have on society. And the reality is, because I was saying it's very difficult to go after the assets because either the evidence is it's there in Russia or it happened then in 1990, you need to bring something to the here and now, to London 2026. Actually, I was thinking 2025. And so the difference that they do in the sense of the racketeering laws is they actually look at what is the current impact of the criminal conduct, of the assets on society. I would argue that kleptocracy and corruption have the same detrimental effect that organized crime is having on our society. But also, if you think of a country like the UK, it's even national security, especially when you add, the whole concept of, for instance, use of illicit money to influence politics, elections, and so forth, or just generally to destabilize democracy. So there is a big case to just say it is a national security issue, is having challenges to national security. So we basically looked at the whole way. Obviously, our recommendations are based for the UK and trying to convince law enforcement officers and just generally policymakers to look at kleptocratic assets in a different way. But I think it's just general. What we found is if you look at kleptocracy differently, if you look at it like a network, like an enterprise, it just opens to you a range of possibilities that potentially we weren't saying before. We haven't got any case studies, but what I can say is even just the last operations, there is one of my favorites is Operation Destabilize. There are a couple of others that actually show that law enforcement has started adopting that networked approach and that networked mindset. And it's leading to lots of results, not only targeting the criminals, but also targeting the professional service providers and targeting the corrupt individuals and their assets, which is always great.
Maria, thank you so much. There's so much to unpack, but I mean, the basic point is it's super useful to think of corruption as a network, and that allows you potentially to be able to target many more of the assets and the people involved behind it. It's also really interesting because of the link between corruption and organized crime, which again I think is underappreciated. And Jacopo and Dr. Saba Casa, who's partner in crime of Jacopo and Claudia, they did some super interesting research in the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and the border between Bulgaria and Turkey, Capitan Andreevo, which really showed this in action. Jacopo, you're going to have to speed through it a little bit because we're a bit behind time, and I want to be able to challenge Maria at the end about what's going to happen if you actually start using some of these laws. So Jacopo and Claudia, feel free also to come in whenever you like during Jacopo's presentation to go through what you saw there. Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm going thank you, Monica, and thank you, Maria, for your very interesting presentation, and like for making all the points that you have made. So time-wise, I'm just going to run a little bit, in presenting the results of these two studies that we have done together in the PRI team. Of course, the first one is together with Saba. What we have seen, so it's exactly the convergence between organized crime on one side and corruption, illicit trafficking. As you know, Rotterdam Harbor is a very important node for drug trafficking. And, what we have seen on one side, more or less 10 years ago, there has been a very strong political prioritization for fighting drug trafficking, and doing this through better detection, the automatization of inspection tools or controls, and so far and so on. What is the consequences of this? On one side, we have the increased enforcement efforts and threat detection. This means that also traffickers face more obstacles to operating effectively. And what this means is that they need for insider help, to be able to finalize and achieve their criminal goals. And what is the point is that corruption becomes even more essential for organized crime of what was before. So the starting point is to fight drug trafficking. At the end of the day, what is the consequences is to have more corruption. Corruption is used strategically, to ensure that the drugs can get, through the container screen and security, or that they can leave the port without detection. So, this is exactly where corruption, it becomes really needed to overcome, to bypass better controls, better inspection, or better surveillance tools. And here is where, we have seen that corruption evolves and adapt, because tend to, to try to evade, to be used to evade these new controls, new surveillance, and new powers and functions. So, the idea we have seen, in Rotterdam, 3 types of corruption is collusion, coercion, and infiltration. The lines between the 3 are blurred. So we can, to have them, for example, in this sort of cycle of adoption of corruption strategies, we start with the high demand for drugs that it is remaining. We have new barriers to trafficking, corruption risk increase. We have stronger anti-corruption measures that are developed. At this point, corruption aims and target can shift towards new aims and targets. And at this point, corrupt can morph, for example, from collusion to coercion, or from coercion to infiltration. So this is, one way to look at the point. But on the other side, we have also the criminal strategies that can change, to overcome, to bypass this new control. And we can have new concealment strategies, but at the same time, we can have the change of the modes of transport, or shifting directly the trafficking routes, to other Dutch ports, for example, in the case of Rotterdam, or to ports in other countries in Europe. That can be Antwerp, can be, Gioia Tauro, can be, Valencia, or you name it. So there are many different situations, and we have seen this happening. Then I want to highlight, spotlight a little bit, the results of another research that we have done together with Saba, with Noemi, our colleague, and with Claudia. That is, of course, the evolution of corruption and criminal modus operandi at the Capitan Andreevo border checkpoint. And here we have used it as a turning point, the process of EU accession that Bulgaria did in the early 2000s. So basically, we had, before the EU accession, we had, of course, already the end of the communist rule and the introduction of new institutional system. We had also a very important economic crisis, the restructuring of the economy, and the shortage of consumer goods, and a very underdeveloped retail sector. So what we had was a specific characteristic, of the criminal behaviors at the border, informal. So we had really the smuggling of consumer and counterfeit goods in Bulgaria, and so far and so on. When we consider, the impact of the change that happened in 2007, of course, we had the imposition of new regulatory frameworks coming, of course, from the EU regulatory framework, the directive that should be implemented also in Bulgaria, and a much stronger detection and surveillance at the border checkpoint between Bulgaria and Turkey, that is, of course, Capitan Andreevo border checkpoint. So the combination of these two changes, so new regulatory frameworks on one side and better or stronger detection and surveillance, provoked, at the end of the day, the emergence of new forms of corruption and criminal modus operandi. And we have seen this in the efforts for smuggling excise goods and evade taxes. Smuggling goods that are under more stringent standards because of the EU directive. For example, we have seen the privatization of public functions, the introduction of routinized schemes of extractive corruption, and also the redefinition, and this is the fifth point, of the criminal strategies for smuggling illicit goods. So this two research was aimed at giving a sort of, idea of bird's eye view of what we have seen, and I hope, Monica, that was a good overview, even if a little bit quick and fast.
At record speed. Thank you so much, Jacopo. I always think I'm always amazed at how creative and quick and entrepreneurial criminals and corrupt people are. You think if they were working on the light side, not the dark side, the world would be a much better place. Claudia, please bring in. I think you were planning to comment on and analyze what some of the implications.
Sure. So I'll be quick. I basically want to touch in very quickly on kind of like my takeaway of why enforcement and controls alone do not work, because networks are resilient, and then more importantly, what we can do about it, right? So, in my mind, there is no question that crime and corruption will evolve as a response of stronger detection and law enforcement efforts. And I think this is particularly relevant for the typologies of corruption where there are supply and demand considerations at play. So, like the case of illicit financial flows and this, enterprise and market of enablers, which of course is a high profit business, right? So as long as as there's somebody else who can take on the managing of assets of kleptocrats, what are my incentives if I'm, a wealth manager? Because if I don't take it, somebody else will, right? So, and the profit incentive is so big that, of course, it's a bit like a whack-a-mole game. You tighten the laws, but corruption is going to emerge elsewhere just because the underlying drivers are so strong. I think that another consideration is that there is a big asymmetry between formal law enforcement action and the modus operandi of the networks and organized crime. So we in our team have done extensive work on informality and informal practices, and what we have learned is that these informal actions do not typically involve practical solutions to problems, be it moving your merchandise across the border undetected or getting your money hidden, but they are also firmly embedded in social understanding. So Jacopo has studied this numerous times, how in building an informal network, whether it's a corrupt and or criminal network, a huge amount of energy goes into building trust, into nurturing and managing personal relationships of the members, enforcing shared social norms. So this means that the informal practices that keep the network together and allow them to be nimble and to be adaptable are in a way intuitive. They are based on social capital and they are functional. So this allows for accounts for the resilience of the informal practices. So yes, criminal networks are flexible and opportunistic. We see this over and over again, and they do not go with a prescribed playbook, right? But they can afford to improvise as they go, and they do. The high caliber networks, in addition, they have so much money, they can afford to recruit like hugely talented people to help them, achieve their goals. So for law enforcement agencies, even in the best case scenario, resources are always going to be more limited. And, Jacopo and Maria have told us that they are Italian and cannot stay behind. Well, I'm Mexican. And what we see, we see so very similar things in Mexico with the criminal networks. They no longer deal only with drugs. They are also criminal enterprises. So they deal also with human trafficking, armed trafficking, kidnappings. They have so much money that they can buy any politician or judge, and they are great innovators. I mean, anybody who has a little bit of a eye on that topic can already know that, be it drones, submarines, the creativity has no limits. And, in this sense, playing by the rules, from the perspective of those law enforcement who want to do good, actually the rule of law limits the range of possible actions in a way that the criminals aren't bound, right? They can just improvise and they can be creative, and with all the money they have, they achieve a lot. So, all right, what do we do about this? Because so far it's a bit of a not such a rosy picture that comes out. And what I want to mention quickly is some work that we've been doing on looking at anticipatory governance, this idea, which obviously comes out of the the result that if we see that corruption evolves, would we like to know and have better tools to anticipate how this is going to happen? And there are, there is a long history of people developing anticipatory and foresight methodologies. There are some, fancy sounding names of methodologies, such as projected transformations, or my favorite, phantasmagorical fiction. Honestly, it is not rocket science. It is about formulating plausible scenarios of how certain trends and patterns might evolve and assess if the relative likelihood. So I think that's not necessarily a bad idea. We ourselves are assessing still the relative merits of these approaches. I am not yet convinced that we can, be too cozy into thinking that we can see into the future. Rather, I'll give you my takeaway of what I think anticipatory governance means for anti-corruption practitioners and implementers. I think that we are operating in such complex social systems, and as we know, they adapt. I think that the key to being better able to work in a context where corruption is evolving is to really spend a lot of time with the implementing teams in mapping and understanding the systems that we're going to change. And I cannot underscore this enough, because when the actors who are at the forefront really understand what are, the typical patterns, the typical behaviors, what are the typical, the basic elements that characterize the systems that we're going to change, then, they will be in a good position as they go about their project or activities implementation to be able to catch the signals of change, right? And this can be positive change, where this would allow then the activities to pivot to see how can we nurture more of that, but it can also help to catch, some negative unintended consequences, and then, swiftly try to come up with mitigating actions. So in my opinion, this is the best that we can achieve or aspire to. But in a way, from the perspective of a lot of the anti-corruption practice that I see, it's not such a small shift, because a lot of development implementers are used to thinking in terms of log frame rationale. So activities, inputs, outputs, outcomes. It's linear. They have their minds locked into their indicators for performance. And I think that this has the risk, of course, that, there might be really relevant change going on that is not captured, with these rigid indicators. And it's normal for somebody who's going to be held accountable to a log frame to lock into these indicators and not look elsewhere. So I think we have to be more open, to understanding the systems and to see even beyond our immediate, environment where the change might be happening. Let me stop here.
Super, thank you so much, Claudia. It's a lot to unpack, but I know that Maria has to leave a little bit early, and I really want to challenge her to come up with some of these plausible scenarios for what might happen. Imagine if the UK government is sitting on this call and they say, that's a fantastic idea. We're going to take Maria's research and we're going to apply anti-organized crime and anti-trafficking laws to corrupt networks. What might happen? What might some of the consequences be, and how can you guard against those?
So I think that what Claudia was saying, it is a bit of a whack-a-mole exercise, regardless of how much you try to protect your system, regardless of how many choice of solutions you're going to elaborate, the criminals don't work within the constraints of the rule of law. So they will always find other ways. We were thinking, even just when, the whole 2022 invasion of Ukraine happened, we were thinking, okay, so if we're protecting the UK system with these new, reforms, is this going to be a displacement risk? Yes, that works, really. I'm not saying that London now is completely clean of dirty money, but we have seen new hotspots appearing and new countries actually say, hey, come to us. We have the best professional service providers in the world. So you can't operate in a silo. It has to be a sort of overall international response to most of the things. What I do believe is you have to be creative and adaptable in the same way. Obviously, we have some constraint that we don't want to overpass. I think that I really love, as I said, due process. And so I think that we need to be kind of starch in saying, no, this is the line that we're not going to cross. However, criminals are not going to say, oh, I'm a corrupt individual. I don't fall into the organized criminal category. I'm so sorry, I don't meet those typologies. Try to look at the different typologies and try to see whether there is a mismatch. There was a question in the Q&A that was saying, what is it, for instance, for financial institutions that they could do to go after and to map corruption? Well, I would say start looking at the networks. It's very likely that the same money laundering controls that you are adopting to identify those red flags, they will pop up, and potentially similar actors are going to pop up once again. So once again, it's a matter of being creative and just like doing, I like to call it like a sort of Frankenstein of approach, but it is what the criminals are doing. They don't stop because, oh, the law is not allowing me to. They say, oh, what else is there out there to help me make money? And that's exactly the same way that we should approach it. Is there anything else that we should be trying to do in order to stop these criminals? Unintended consequences, as I said, I think that there are potentially unintended consequences the moment that we pass that line that we put ourselves, and that, as democracies, we need to uphold specific values that I would not negotiate at all. So, just to make a very easy example, sanctions as a tool to tackle corruption, they're a very useful tool. I think they're a tool in the arsenal. However, they can go so far. We need to define how far they can go, where do they stop, and then let the rest of the criminal justice procedures and processes to take charge. The same of what I said about, thinking of corruption as a national security threat. There are unintended consequences to securitization processes, which we need to be careful of. And that may give the weapon to, we think about corruption and kleptocracy, we think about some specific states that have been wielding corruption as a weapon to destabilize. We need to be careful that we don't actually give them even more ammunitions just by trying to protect our own system. So as long as we're creative, as long as we're agile, we're not going to catch them all. Like, it's not like Pokemon, but at least the hope is to get a couple of assets and potentially repurposing them to the victims of corruption.
Thanks so much, Maria. Feel free to drop off whenever you need to go, and we'll just stay for the last couple of minutes. But I mean, it's the idea of the whack-a-mole. I mean, at least being able to anticipate where the mole is going to pop up would be useful. But what I love about, well, one thing I love about Claudia, Jacopo, Saba's work, and Naomi's work, is that they're really trying to stop the mole from popping up. In afterwards by changing, social norms, beliefs, how the political economy works. So I think that's super interesting. That's another topic for another webinar. And the third topic for the other webinar is how to find a better word for enablers. So Maria is definitely going to come to that. Thank you so much. There's one quick question that I was hoping, maybe Jacopo, for you, that Dr. Fletcher Tembo.
Yes, I've seen it. It's a very interesting. Yeah.
Should we not, I'll just repeat the question, shouldn't we think about the factors shaping how corruption evolves as contextual conditions, but also new individuals and new node members getting more sophisticated? Jacopo, can you take that quickly in the last few minutes?
It's a very, very good point, and you are right. I guess, there is to make a difference between incremental or radical changes. So the one you are making as a point is much more, in the short time, new nodes enter in a node. Of course, they have different strategies. They have different skills. They can be, very young and be much better in using new technology than me, or so this is an incremental change in the same contextual condition. What we have tried to look with Claudia was really a change in time, over times, with much more years in the meantime for the evolving, of the contextual condition. And the point is that when there is a scandal, often there is also an effort to reform the system. Many times reforms comes together with scandals. Or, in the meantime, there are, so the point that you have done, it's very right. And my answer to this, so you have not lost anything. It's just a different, like here we are speaking about the complexity of this mechanism. Like the point you are focusing on is much more in the short time and a sort of incremental change. While what we are referring to is a little bit the perspective, the time horizon is a little bit longer, mid-long time, and the changes are much more consistent also in the contextual conditions. So we see much more space for innovation and adaptation to the changes in the contextual condition. But the point you have made, it's very good at the end of the day.
Super, thanks very much. Last minute, let's have last takeaway from Claudia, one from Jacopo. Thanks.
Well, I think just following up on what Jacopo said, the truth is that reality, the world we're living is so complex. There are so many pieces and variables that are moving at the same time. We, of course, didn't have the time to really speak about technology and, how, information landscape has changed so radically in the last few years. So all of this is really, and I think it calls us to really shift our conceptual framework to one of thinking in terms of complex adaptive systems. And this means that we cannot keep thinking that change is linear. We cannot keep thinking that we can predict, what the outcomes of our actions should be, and that we should really focus more our attentions into trying to understand the systems, detect the changes, and also to work with the stakeholders who we would hope would change the behaviors, and look at more closely at their incentives, at their relationships, and so on, and work with them from where they are, rather than some aspirational goal that we might still be pursuing, but we're not there yet. So to be real and to be grounded.
Absolutely, embrace that complexity and work with it in your favor. Jacopo, last word, and then we'll say goodbye to our participants.
No, yes, I will close just with a very quick note that how this work is contributing to see how corruption and anti-corruption are intrinsically related in a sort of uninterrupted dance. Okay, we evolve, corruptors evolve. Who is better to to transform? But the point is, we see often that corruptors are 2 steps ahead of us as anti-corruptor. We have somehow to accept that and try to identify strategies, measures for approaching as best as we can to this dance that is somehow ineludible, and it cannot be basically eliminated. So do our best for dancing as anti-corruptors as best as we can.
I was hoping to end on a positive note, but there are many positive moments, but we have to be prepared for the backlash and the negative parts. Hey, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Claudia, Jacopo, Maria, who's had to jump off to another event. We'll send an email to all registered participants with the relevant research papers, and Jacopo, if he can also share his slides. And I think that we can also offer certificates if needed. So just let us know if that's necessary. Yes. Thank you so much, everybody. And see you for the next one.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.